We're going to talk now about specific sectors of the Montana economy, one by one, and we're going to begin with tourism. And to my untrained eye, 2010 was a different year than 2009. I heard my old friend Al Nash on public radio from Yellowstone Park talk about the record numbers of visitors there. My annual trip to Glacier Park this year saw full parking lots, full hotels. We had to wait for tables in restaurants, so it was very busy in Glacier. And I noticed this year on the highways a heck of a lot more RVs and campers on the road. So all of those were sort of empirical, anecdotal things from my perspective. But now we're going to hear the true story and also hear kind of what's in store for the tourism industry from Norma Nickerson. So Norma, come on up.
Thanks, Ian. Appreciate the introduction. Are you warming up out there? Because I sure haven't. If I start shaking, I apologize because I'm really, really cold, but I'm working on it. So, welcome again. Good morning. Hope you're doing well. Hope you got your coffee and your stretch and you're ready for another round of lots of information. I'm going to do something a little bit different this year, but I want to preface it with, what is the tourism industry in the state of Montana? $2.3 billion of non-resident contribution and flowing around the state, over 25,000 jobs, $661 million in personal income, $153 million in state and local taxes paid by non-residents as they come and go in our state. And it is one of the top contributors in basic labor income for the state of Montana. That kind of gives you a frame of the importance of tourism in the state, and one of the measures that we use. We've also used a lot of other measures about how tourism has been in the state. And I'm going to put that in there and then tell you what happened in 2010, and Ian, you are correct. It was a better year than 2009. Visitation was up 4%, so non-resident visitation is one of our measures. About 10 million, a little over 10 million non-residents come into the state on a regular basis every year. Air travel was up a little over 2%. Glacier Park, as you mentioned, up 8.9%. Not a record year, but close to it. Yellowstone, if you remember last year, I mentioned that it was a record year. Guess what? They were up again, 8.3%. So it was another record year. Rooms sold in Montana, 5.6%, and skier visits were up 2.3%. So that's how we've generally been measuring and keeping an eye on what's happening in the tourism industry. But here's my question. How should we measure tourism? Are those numbers and those indicators the way it should be? And some people would say maybe it should be through geotourism. And what is geotourism? It's a new concept for many people. And it was actually coined by National Geographic, and they're the ones that are pushing this concept of geotourism. It's tourism that sustains and enhances the geographical character of a place, including the environment, the heritage, the aesthetics, the well-being of its residents, the culture, and it's all about what we do here in Montana. It's about Montana ranches, it's about the communities, it's about how we live and work. It's the protected areas in this state. And the idea behind geotourism is to get people to come here who have the same value system as us, not to try to change who we are in the state, but who appreciate and want to learn about Montana and Montana's culture and heritage and everything else that we have. So how is that happening? I got ahead of myself there. If we were to measure geotourism and use it as indicators, what would it be? And this gives you an idea of what geotourism kind of is referring to as well. Our clean water, our clean air could be an indicator. The wildlife viewing opportunities that we have around this state Are they going up or down? What's going on out there? Could be an indicator. The amount of open space that we have available that we see every day when we're traveling around the state ourselves. Unimpaired night skies. You wouldn't believe on our surveys how many people say, wow, the stars were just amazing, because they don't get to see them back home. And we have it out there. Amount of access to the public land. So it's not just the open space, but can I go out there and actually play in it? And we've had issues over the past few years where some of the lands are getting purchased by private people and they're blocking off the gates, and that's not a good thing. So how much access is there to our public lands and waterways? Pedestrian-friendly atmosphere in our communities. The main streets, again, back to our communities, what their local culture is it showing and it being reflected in those communities and on the main streets, and the walking and biking paths that are very important. These could be the measures that we use for tourism in the state. And what's fun about that is that's also what we all want as we live here. Those are the things that we live here for, and that's what the non-residents are coming here for. So how is it happening? How do we do that? How do we measure these things? Or why would we want to do that? Because visitors, like I mentioned, are coming here for the same reason that we live here. And how would we do that? Here's a couple ways that have already started, and if you have not seen them yet, there are 2 National Geographic funded and supported maps, they call them map guides, of the Crown of the Continent area and the Greater Yellowstone area. I don't know if many of you have seen these. They're available to you as well as all the non-residents who could come here. These 2 map guides were basically developed by locals who live in those regions. They said, here's the unique spot about where I live in Choteau, Montana, and you should go to this store or stay at this bed and breakfast or go to our rodeo. Things that you don't hear about as much. And as it's promoted in these types of map guides, and by the way, they also have websites that have way more on them than what's in these maps, it gets people to explore kind of the little unknown, which in turn supports the local community. Economically, probably more than anything else, but it brings the people together with the non-residents. Another way that the geotourism is expanding in the state of Montana is the Office of, or not the Office of Tourism, the Tourism Advisory Council, which is a 15-member group of people appointed by the governor every year, has put together a charter, started in 2007. It's just starting to get some momentum, but in that charter, and this is butchered, I'm telling you, it's a lot bigger than this, and I had to try to make it on one slide, and you're probably looking at that, and well, that's too much to look at anyway. But it's basically the idea of maintaining the integrity of place, our sense of place, the character that we have here, what is unique to Montana, promoting conservation of our energy, our water, and our wildlife, which are important things both for the non-residents and residents who live here. Stewardship partnerships to maintain Montana assets. In other words, people have to work together to make things work the way they want to. Draw visitors who help sustain Montana's distinct character, and I'll be talking about that a little bit too, and bringing in these geotourists, which means we have to have the products and services which are more of that local thing. And then the satisfaction of these people through educating you folks as well as the non-residents and the benefits of what sustainable tourism is all about. They're hoping by 2012, so a year from now, to have at least 50 counties and 75 cities as well as numerous organizations adopt this charter. And why would anybody want to adopt a charter like this? It's sort of like guiding principles, if you will. This is what kind of would guide how we would work in our community, our county, our organization. Who has adopted it so far, and I'm not going to go through this list, but there's a number of them out there. There's some cities, there's some counties, and a lot of different organizations who have said, yeah, this is a good principle by which we want to move forward with. Well, along with all that, they're talking about doing geotourism and bringing in these geotourists. So the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research has done a number of different studies related to the geotraveler. One of the things that we did ask visitors is how important are all these various attributes that are related to this concept of geotourism to them while they are traveling in Montana. And on a scale of 1 to 6, with 6 being the most important, here's how they the top ones came out, is clean, and you'll notice that this list looks like that other one that I had before. What a surprise. Clean water, clean air, wildlife viewing opportunities, amount of open space, the scenic vistas, access to the public lands, Montana's land ethic. All of these things are what they put at the top of their list, which means that's why they come here. And if we as a state don't protect and encourage these sorts of things, we would start losing the non-residents because they'll go somewhere else where they have those things. And somebody did ask a question at one of the other seminars and said, well, do the geo-travelers actually stay longer and spend more money? And a study that we did show that they spend more money. We're not looking at quantity of people coming in, we're looking at the types of people coming in, or I shouldn't say I just do the data collection. The Office of Tourism and all the other people who are promoting and trying to get visitors to this state. We also ask people about their satisfaction levels on a lot of these attributes. And let me tell you, non-resident visitors are happy. They're happy campers, quote unquote, when they're here in Montana. They're very, very satisfied. So they're basically satisfied with everything, but you'll notice that amount of open space was their number one thing that they were the most satisfied on. The character of Montana was the third highest one. Now, I can't tell you what that means, and I don't know if you can tell. Maybe Ian could tell us what the character of Montana is. But we have one, and the non-residents know it. So keep up your character because they like that. And again, the stewardship of the land, it shows throughout Montana that we have a good stewardship of our land. What are they least satisfied with? Guess what? The availability of recycling bins. And you might giggle, and I do too, but you know, when you think about it, and this has been my little pet peeve, you know, I do drink Diet Coke once in a while. And I will have this bottle, and I go to the gas station to get gas as I'm traveling around the state. And what do I do with that bottle? I have to throw it away because there is no recycling bin. And that is one of my pet peeves. They also are not as happy with the environmental practices of accommodations, like places like this. Do you see recycling bins hanging around? You know, every hotel anymore has the old sign in your bathroom, you know, if you put your towel on the floor, we'll wash it, but we can conserve energy if you don't put it on the floor and use it again. Well, that's not going to satisfy the geo-travelers anymore. And by the way, you too can be a geo-traveler just by how you act, and if it's your value system, you fit right in. But they're not as happy with the rest areas. That's nothing new. We've heard that year after year after year on our surveys. And the road conditions, which you can't do a whole lot about, especially if it's wintertime, and they're saying they didn't like the road conditions. Another study that we did in the past year was asking how high a priority is it that the tourism industry do these following things. And these themes that are on this slide are based on that charter. So what we did is we asked both tourism business owners around the state and residents around the state and looked at, are they on the same page? And actually, they are on the same page in terms of they all think they're high priority. But what's interesting is the order of the priority, and when you do a statistical significant difference between them, the only one that isn't different is maintain, there it is again, the character of Montana. Both the tourism business owners and the residents, you know, they agree that that's this high of a priority. But what's interesting is the business owners believe that maintaining Montana's destination appeal is a number one priority. Number one priority for the residents was that the tourism industry should strive to hire local people. But the tourism industry said that was number 4 in their list. So what we're seeing here in this particular survey is a little bit of a disconnect between the residents and the tourism business owners, and I think, you know, it's one of those things that needs to be worked on by the tourism industry, is try to get the residents and the owners back in line again. Once again, with saying that, they all agree that they're high priorities. So what does all of this mean? We're talking geo-travelers, we're talking all that. Well, again, it's over a $2 billion industry, but it's made up mostly of our Montana entrepreneurs, small business owners, who are also citizens of the state. The citizens and the visitors desire the same attributes for when we're living here, our quality of life, for the resident or non-residents who are coming here, it's the quality of their experience. And it only makes sense for us to strive for authentic places that do bring in those geo-travelers, because those are the types of people who are going to appreciate what we have, who will support Montana's culture, our aesthetic desires, environmental concerns, and our way of life. One way that the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research has done this, we put together a handbook. We call it a geotourism handbook. It could be used by anybody. It's online. Don't print it out, because within that handbook there's a whole bunch of links that you could go to. And those links will take you to whatever county you're living in. It might tell you what and where you can recycle in your particular county. It'll talk about where you can find farmers markets around the state of Montana. There are, and I didn't put these together, these are already in existence. And some of them are organizations, and some of them are actually state or county government websites that tell people these things. But it's all related to the types of things, where do you buy locally made, locally grown products? How do I conserve energy and still not fork out a lot of money to do that? All of these things are in this handbook, and I invite you to go ahead and look at that if that's something of interest. And as we move towards more and more people, the geo-travelers coming in and residents of the state starting to demand those things, it'll work. Okay, so I can't help but go back to the old measurements, because that's what we have. What are we expecting for 2011? Non-resident visitation should go up about 2%. Rooms sold, nationally, they're saying about 1.5% increase. Yellowstone, wow, if this really happens, they're going to have their third year in a row of record attendance. So get there early, because July is always their biggest month. You want to get there before that. 3.3% increase is their prediction. Glacier, barely, 0.3% increase. Skier visits should be up at least 2%. It's been a great snow year in most of the state, and so that number might be a little low. Airline deboarding's up about 1%. And in our annual survey of Montana business owners, we asked them what they expected, because they have their pulse on what's going on, and 55% of them said it's going to increase this year for them. Only 8% said it was going to decrease, that the remaining then said it was basically going to remain the same. So they're way more optimistic than they have been in the last 2 years, when the recession was certainly hitting everybody. So with that, I'm on time, I guess, and we'll open it up for just a couple questions. Thank you.
Again, Mike's in the middle.
Forgot to mention, if you didn't pick up one of our economic reviews, there's still a few left out there on the table, and it reviews 2008 and 2009 and gives you more information than you probably would need to know.
And a question.
Good morning, Norma. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if there's any studies showing that tourists who fly to Montana choose their destinations based on airline rates, because I know ours are rather high.
Oh, that's a very good question. A lot of people have that question, and we might actually be doing a study in this next year related to just that, asking non-residents where, if they flew on any portion of their trip, where they came in. If they didn't fly into Montana, because we get a lot of people flying into Spokane, Seattle, Denver, Salt Lake, and driving into the state, we're going to see if we can find out that. We think we know the answer, but it's always nice to verify it. We don't have a lot of capacity that comes into this state, and that's the big issue. So when they fill up and they can demand those high prices, if you're in business, why would you change that? And so that's a tough one, and it's something that the tourism industry struggles with all the time. And it affects us as people who live here.
Norma, we get a new travel slogan every year, and we get to see the slogans for some other states that advertise here, California and some others. The various tourism regions come out with different approaches, and then we've got things like the Ice Age Lakes Trail, the Glacial Lake Missoula kind of thing. Other parts of the state have their own little tourism trails. Do all of those actually have an impact, or are we really at the mercy of the weather and gasoline prices and airfares? Are those the things that really drive it?
Well, gasoline prices, you would bring up that one. That's a scary one. I didn't want to mention it. You've probably heard that they're saying by 2012 we'll be at $5 or more for gasoline. When we hit $4 in 2008, the summer of 2008, that didn't kill, but it drastically affected the tourism industry. And if that happens again, I assume that we'll have a similar result. But at that time, things were already heading down and people were getting a little nervous. The good thing about the travel industry is people need vacations. We're always going to go somewhere. It's how far. And if the prices for gas bring it up, what we see, and you heard this over the last few years, the staycation or stay closer to home, that's then what happens. So people still travel, they don't travel as far.
So we should still strive to create that positive image so that when people decide, all right, we've got this amount of money, we want to give them a good image so they'll come.
Yeah, as in any marketing, if you're not out there, people will forget about you, or your competition is out there, and then they go, well, let's go to Colorado, because that's top of mind.
Yes, sir.
Norma, I know that you include this presentation as part of the economic presentation because of the fact that it is an important part of our economy. But I think people tend to think of tourism as something that really just affects hotels and airlines and maybe rental car, and they don't think about maybe some of the other ways and amounts that tourism affects our economy. Could you kind of talk about that a bit and throw some numbers out there?
Throw some numbers out there. Oh, boy. Tourism is one of those industries that affects all of you in the room. And the larger community that you live in, the less likely you are to feel the impact of tourism. The rural areas, the smaller areas, it doesn't take a whole lot of people to come into your community for you to be both economically impacted on a positive side and sometimes negatively impacted because you're feeling like, man, I had to wait behind two cars at the stoplight and I never have to do that. So, you know, it's got its benefits and its negatives depending on where you live and what you're used to. But it brings in, when I say it's a $2 billion industry in the state of Montana, that's including those business owners that you mentioned, the hotels and the rental cars and the airline people and everybody who's directly working with the people that are coming in, but they're then paying for their mortgage and going to the grocery store and buying all the things that they're doing. And so as in any industry, it's very much a ripple effect. It's just that tourism is up there in front of everybody's eyes probably more than many of the other industries. Maybe agriculture is up there in front of everybody's eyes because we see it daily as we drive around the state. But it's a big impact. And the other thing that it does do, if we didn't have the tourism that we have, you thought the airline issue was bad or is bad now, if we didn't have the non-resident industry, and I've mentioned this before, I don't know if it was here, but we wouldn't have the airline service that you see. We are so lucky. So we might complain, but I grew up in Grand Forks, North Dakota. They have one airline there now, and it comes 3 or 4 times a day. And that's it. And you have to fly to Minneapolis. It's the only way you can go. That's what we would end up with here if we didn't have the visitors. So we have to be thankful for that. And there's other things similar. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, sir.
My question's on a similar vein. As a Montanan, we often like to keep this state to ourselves in a sense, and it's okay for the tourists to come, but as long as they don't stay and crowd our streets, like you said. But I think as a business owner, I see what's needed is a coordinated effort by the tourism and travel industry to co-op with the chambers of commerce to attract people, because the only thing that's going to help our industries and our businesses is for inflow, you know, people moving here permanently, and if they get a taste of it on a vacation, they may want to come and you know, build a home. It's going to affect all sorts of industries, not just travel, but construction and real estate and retail. So is there a coordinated effort on the part of your industry to work with all the chambers in the various cities?
I think there is around the entire state. The chambers do know that the travel industry is very important to their particular chamber and vice versa. They do work together, as far as I know, and anybody can, I don't know, is Kim Luttrell here? I know here in Missoula we have a Convention and Visitor Bureau that's somewhat separate from the chamber, but I certainly hope that they're working together because it is important. When people do relocate, they want to know what's in the community and what's around here, and all of those things tend to pop up on the non-resident, what they want to have in this state as well. So as far as I know, they work together, and they work together quite well.
And this will need to be the last question on this section so we can get moving. But yes, sir.
Okay, really quick, maybe you could talk about what percentage of the tourism is related to hunting, and if you and your department ever have the discussion, or if the wolf equation ever gets considered.
Ooh, we can get controversial here. We did an outfitter guide study a number of years ago, and $83 million that are dropped in this state are based on hunters and fishermen and people who take guided trips in this state. Specifically, they come here for those trips. So that's just, and then the rest of the industry, I think it's $146 million that's dropped total because they come here and it's one piece of their entire trip. That's with the guides and outfitters in the state. The wolf thing, oh boy, you know, Yellowstone has really benefited from it. Gardner, Montana gets wolf watchers, and if you've been there, and maybe you're one of those, they're fanatics. I mean, they're out there, it's 20 below, and they're standing there with their spotting scope and their binoculars really looking at the wolves. The thing with the wolves, though, is really, where are you going to see them except maybe in Yellowstone? You can't see them around the rest of the state. We might claim them in Montana, but you actually have to get into Yellowstone to see them because they don't come out and visit us during the day when people want them to. It's contentious. I don't know where it's going to go. I know hunters and a lot of people think the wolves are reason for the elk decrease number, and there is proof that that does happen. There might be other things that are going on as well, so I don't think that one's going to go away for a while. I do know that non-residents and people in general, any animal tends to win because heaven help us that we harm this cute little animal. It's warm and fuzzy and can't defend for itself or whatever it may be. And so it's going to be a tough one to work towards, and there has to be some, I think, cooperation amongst all the groups on that issue. And I think I better stop talking because I've taken more of my time. I'm just going to say that if you want one of these, I have about 4 of them. I'm sitting right over there, and they will go fast, so you can have either one of them. Thank you.
Our next topic, go ahead. You know, barely a day goes by when we don't hear something about health care, whether it's national policy, state policy, or the relationship between the two, or whether it's, maybe there's a throat guy in the house, or whether it's advertisements or promotion of our local healthcare providers or insurance providers. We literally hear about healthcare every single day. And so to tell us about what's happening in healthcare and what the outlook is for the healthcare industry, here's Greg Davis from the Bureau. Came to us from Flathead Valley Community College, so he's a Western Montanan for a long time. Greg, tell us about healthcare.
Thanks, Ian. I'm on a short leash because I've been going over, but I'm still going to tell a story. I've got a lot of grief over this first slide, but I did age profiling, and I think most people in this room know who this is. I was told by the youngins in our office that I should go with a Doogie Howser. But they're missing the point. This Marcus Welby is actually visionary in a sense that I'll describe here in a minute. Robert Young, who played Marcus Welby, was supposedly at a physicians conference, and this was the first time the physician community had to deal with a fictional character that had a very positive image on TV. And a reporter was standing next to Robert Young, and a physician approached Robert Young and said, you know, you've created a real quandary in my practice. My patients all tell me I'm not as nice to them as you are to your patients. And Robert Young, who was never one to be too short on words, said, well, you're probably not. Medicare is a huge issue, and I'll argue that, at the basis of the reform are Medicare issues. Where Medicare goes, so too will health care. Medicare is projected to grow at 7% annually for the next decade. Take the most optimistic of any and all projections, they don't even come close, which means Medicare is going to continually gobble up a bigger share of the economic pie year to year to year. First, to understand how Medicare might affect Montana, and Medicare might affect Montana providers, we have to understand how big this industry is. And I guess in a sense we're all up here pitching our industries. Healthcare is big. If you look at healthcare employment as one proxy for that, it was about 15% of the employment in 2007. It grew to 17% in just 2 years in 2009. And that's usually the case. You'll see a slide here in a minute. When we have economic downturns, thank God for healthcare. It keeps growing, albeit at a slower pace, but it keeps growing. One other visual to illustrate the importance of healthcare in Montana is this slide. It's just simply looking at each state's share of gross domestic product devoted to healthcare. And look at the dark blue there. There's only a half a dozen other states that devote more of their resources in gross domestic product toward healthcare than is the case in Montana. So healthcare is an important player in Montana, and how healthcare changes then will have ramifications in Montana. Healthcare, the growth rate, we probably all know, it's always positive, but it is countercyclical. There's all employment for Montana, all industries. There's the 2009 recession. There's healthcare employment. Notice these are growth rates, so anything above that zero axis is happy times. It just means that when it's trending down, the growth rate is slowing, but you're still growing. And what caused that slowdown, that deceleration, if you will, in the growth rate, were really job losses in social assistance category of health care. If you look at all employment in Missoula County, that's the green line, it tracked the blue line quite well, and then you look at health care employment in Missoula County, again rather counter-cyclical, but always positive. And that rather steep deceleration was again mainly due to job losses and social assistance. One more visual on it. There's the composition of healthcare employment. We traditionally define it as social assistance occupations, that's vocational rehab, family services, those kinds of things, ambulatory care, physicians, dentists, chiropractors, therapists of all kinds, community health centers, hospitals, no explanation needed there, and nursing and residential facilities. Notice that from year to year, this is indexed to 2005, we're climbing the steps upward. That means employment is growing. It's a growing field. The depth of the bars tells you the share of each component in healthcare. And there you'll notice the shrinking in social assistance and the growth in nursing and residential, and the rather stationary, static, if you will, hospital. Where do we spend? We estimate $6 billion in personal health care spending in Montana. Big industry, $6 billion. Most of it, 41%, is going to hospitals, and right behind that would be physicians and clinical. Who pays for that spending? This is the nature of the topic today, Medicare. We're in a year of transition. It's still private payers that pick up most of the tab. But this is a year of transition thanks to the baby boomers. I read a statistic, one baby boomer every 8 seconds qualifies for Medicare, starting in December, continuing until the year 2029. There's 78 million of us in the queue that are slowly qualifying for Medicare. So you'll notice that the balance, the tipping point is this year. Years henceforth, the public payer will become the dominant player. Who pays, however, depends on what we're buying. And I want to illustrate just 3 categories here. And look at hospitals. 30% of their revenues, Medicare. Home health, big factor there. 39% Medicare dependent, and durable medical equipment, 33%. And what was it, 3 days ago now? The Department of Health and Human Services just issued new guidelines on durable medical equipment. They identified it as a risk category for Medicare fraud, and if you've been reading the papers, that's where a lot of the Medicare fraud has been occurring. Most healthcare employment is in hospitals. This is for Montana. It's 36%. Here in Missoula County, it's 31%. For you Ravalli County folks, it's about 24%. Where do Montana hospitals get their revenue? Well, this is consistent with the slide right before the last. About 34% of net hospital revenues in this state are derived from Medicare. Notice the private sector, that's out of pocket, and private insurance is 55%. But keep in mind that dark purple wedge is shrinking and the light blue wedge is increasing through time. Changes in Medicare are going to have differential impacts in terms of where we live. This again is looking at Medicare revenue by hospital, by area. And when I did this for all counties, and rural counties almost always come out on the high end, urban counties more toward the low end, and I think probably the primary reason there would be we have probably more 65 plus population, working jobs, claiming employer-sponsored insurance is the primary, Medicare would be the secondary. Those possibilities are less likely in rural areas. And before you can think of reasons why that might be a wrong answer, we'll move to the next slide. Medicare and the late adulthood population. I put late adulthood. I'm a baby boomer. A lot of baby boomers are in this room. We don't want to be called 65 plus. We certainly don't want to be called elderly. We certainly don't want to be called senior citizens. So the new buzzwords we're all going to be hearing about, late adulthood, and there's one right behind that, the experienced population. And I like the experienced population because immediately I flash back to 1970 in my room listening to Jimi Hendrix. Remember the album, Are You Experienced? The correlation between Medicare payments and 65 plus population, I did this for every county in the state. Perfect correlation as one would expect, because about 85% of the Medicare beneficiaries qualify by age, the other 15% by disability. So if you look at that county's share of the total statewide 65 plus population, and that county's grab of Medicare Part A, that's the hospital insurance, and Medicare Part B, that's the physician supplemental insurance, perfectly correlated, almost perfectly correlated. Where it gets squirrely is when you look at that Medicare spending per 65 plus population. Now, one qualifier here, this is not Medicare spending per Medicare beneficiary. We hear a lot about that as a way of trying to force hospitals to act more like the low-cost providers. This is simply Medicare payments divided by the 65 plus population. Wheatland County, I put in there because that's the outlier. Notice Gallatin County, way down there. Plausible explanations, again, employer-sponsored insurance perhaps. Rural areas probably have a higher percentage of the 75 and 85 plus population. And if you look at healthcare spending by age cohorts, it's a steep linear trend from about 55 on. 55 seems to be the tipping point. That's when health insurance companies get real nervous about insuring you. But it's a steep linear trend upward. And I always like that line from the Verizon. That graph makes a lot of sense if you don't think about it. About $11 billion comes into this state from the federal government alone, 28% of that to the Department of Health and Human Services, from the Department of Health and Human Services. That's a big chunk of money. And what we did in the office is we modeled that in terms of what's that impact on the economy, the fact that so much federal health care money comes into our state. And in terms of Medicare spending alone, which was $1.8 billion in federal fiscal year 2009, we estimate that it sustains or creates 21,000 jobs. Labor income generated a little over $1 billion, and average wages of $52,000. That's the nature of the healthcare industry. Average wages in all of Montana are more like around $33,000. And the important part of this slide is that's net of Medicare taxes paid. We already took out your 2.9% payroll tax for Part A Medicare out of that, returned it back to you. So those are net job creations. There's its contribution in terms of healthcare jobs. That 21,000 includes jobs all over the gamut. It's not just healthcare jobs, because there's huge spillover effects, as Norma was referring to earlier in her tourism industry. More so, I believe, in healthcare. Think about it. When you go to a doctor, what kind of checks does he need to write to keep that office open? That's a huge spillover effect into local businesses. But there's the percentages in terms of Medicare and the importance on the healthcare jobs. About 43% we estimate in terms of employment in hospitals. If we throw in Medicaid, and again what we'll do is we'll return the state match part back to the taxpayers, we'll give that back to you, and we'll look at net job creation, throw that in with Medicare now, it's over 52,000 jobs statewide. And again, that's not just in healthcare. $2.4 billion in labor income and over $4 billion in sales for all various industries in Montana. And for healthcare specifically, huge chunks of healthcare employment. We estimate as much as maybe 3/4 of all hospital jobs are Medicare and Medicaid dependent. And keep in mind that pendulum is slowly swinging more toward public funding. This was the first year, thanks to Dick Brown at the Montana Hospital Association, that we polled Montana hospitals and tried to ask them, what do you think is going to be the environment due to the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act? We had almost a 70% response rate and a lot of handwritten comments. These hospital administrators are very impassioned about what the future holds. And this is 4 or 5 years ahead. Most of them feel the environment that's been created is highly uncertain. And that's why you can go, if you think healthcare reform is going to increase costs, you're going to find very learned literature that supports you. If you think it's going to lower costs, again, you're going to find lots of good data that supports that argument. Right behind that, 28% thought it was unfavorable. Only 3% thought that the new healthcare reform was favorable to the hospital environment. Almost all believe that we're going to see great increases in the use of mid-levels, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, more so in the rural areas. About 6 out of 10 hospitals think we're going to see decreased hospital numbers through mergers and or bankruptcies. These are the smaller hospitals, many of which would be critical access hospitals, being subsumed by larger hospitals. And here's the Marcus Welby effect. That's why we had Marcus Welby on that slide. If you recall the series, he began his practice in a hospital. Midway through the series, he migrated to the suburbs. By the end of the series, at the end of the 15-year run of that series, he was back in a hospital. That was visionary. 2 out of 10 physician searches in 2005 ended up in employment in a hospital. In 2010, it's 4 out of 10, and almost everybody agrees that number will continue to climb. And what's driving that is the move to accountable care organizations. That's a big backbone if you know anything about the healthcare legislation. In a sense, it's a bundled payment where they're going to throw some money at you and say, here, manage this patient. So you're going to need a wide swath of different healthcare providers. It's best if we put them all under one roof so they can be managed. The patient can be better managed. But in terms of the hospital's viewpoint, a lot of uncertainty as to whether the move to ACOs can work in a rural state like Montana. In terms of staffing, increased staffing, it's a continuing field of growth, and an average of about 23 to 25% growth over the next 4 or 5 years. And the main challenges ahead, almost leading the pack unanimously, are workforce issues. Not only the recruitment, but the retention of healthcare providers, and right behind that was access to the capital markets, since technology changes and the capital has to change frequently in the healthcare environment. And with that, I would take questions.
Well, let me ask one, Greg. Knowing what you've shared with us about the importance of Medicare and Medicaid dollars for health employment, it sounds like our health providers in Missoula and elsewhere are going to be paying a lot of attention to what Congress does with the budget over these next.
Well, very much so. I think Paul or Pat was mentioning, you know, the by law cuts to physician payments. That was supposed to be a 23% cut. And that's been nullified at least for the year through December of this year. They got a 2.2% increase. The healthcare law actually has some bonus payments for primary care docs, 10% in there. The doc fix is a great unknown. That's going to be a big driver behind Medicare policy. If you look at studies and what happens with healthcare employment, number one driver is changes in Medicare policy. And so going back to Medicaid, we calculate that in order to save 1 state dollar in Medicaid, you got to give up over $3 worth of benefits in the Medicaid program. And that's because of the federal match.
All right, Greg, thank you very much. You know, as you saw Paul's chart about the major economic sectors in Missoula, agriculture is not one of those. We do have agriculture here, but it's not nearly as important as it is in other parts of the state. But nonetheless, our state's economy is tremendously dependent on agriculture. And so for that reason, we have George Haynes with us. George is from Montana State University's Department of Agricultural Economics, and just regular old economics as well. So he will give us an overview on what's coming up for wheat and cattle and all things agricultural. George?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ian. Even though agriculture isn't on the forefront here in the western part of the state, really it impacts us all because there's a lot of money that's spent over here in Missoula as a result of how the agricultural economy is going in Montana. I want to start off and talk just a little bit about this Great Recession and agriculture in general. Agriculture survived this Great Recession in pretty good shape, even though we've had some kind of up and down years, and we'll look at those here in just a minute. The big thing is that we've had this year that's been a really quite unusual year. In fact, when I go to farm meetings, I now carry a thank you note in my pocket to have all those farmers and ranchers, especially the farmers, sign it to send a thank you to Vladimir Putin in Russia for his embargo for wheat exiting the Soviet Union. That's been a huge issue here, exiting Russia this year. It's been a huge issue in Montana agriculture. The balance sheet for farms and ranches is still very good. Those of you that own businesses, if you had a 12% debt to equity ratio, you'd be very happy. We'll talk about that some. On the crop size, wheat's really been the issue. We've also had just an incredible production year here. I don't know if you noticed what a great summer we had to grow crops here, but we had an overall average of over 46 bushel on wheat and barley in Montana, which actually was record-setting. We can thank our experiment stations and also, of course, the weather for that happening. The ranchers in Montana, things are looking better. We've had a long run of not very good livestock prices in the state. The two big livestock sectors in the U.S. actually that have been very good this year have been dairy and hogs. In fact, that's actually driven most of the increase in agricultural output, but we don't do much of that here. The Hooterites do quite a few hogs, but not much else. We don't do much dairy here. We're going to look at a bunch of numbers here and take a look at how Montana did during this how Montana agriculture did during this recession. This is BEA data, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. As you can see, the red line there is just the U.S. economy, and the Montana economy looks about like that, only at a lower, instead of being $1 trillion sort of economy, or in trillions of dollars, we would lower that line down some. Look at the green line, that's Montana agriculture. You can see we've had our ups and downs. Last year wasn't very good, we're now up a little bit this year, but again, over that entire period of time, we've done okay. Cash receipts are really looking quite favorable this year. In fact, I think when the dust settles, this will be the best cash receipts year that we've had across this entire time span since the early 1990s. It looks very favorable, and we're hoping that this will likely be driven by this increase in wheat prices that we see going on right now. The story that's really troubling, though, look at this. If you go back to this graph and then look at this is net farm income. Out on the right-hand side of that doesn't look very good to me. And what's going on? Well, when we go around to these farm meetings these days, we spend a lot of time talking about leasing. People leasing either land in or out, and that's what's built into some of these net farm income numbers. We have a lot of people that have now retired, and they're leasing out to these other operations, and so we see these farm income numbers going to the operator don't look quite as positive as we'd like. We might also take a look at it from the balance sheet side. There are several realtors here. Montana agriculture has been very different in terms of some of the land values. If you go in the Midwest, you go to Nebraska or Iowa today, those land prices are up by 25–30% over the last couple of years, almost across the board. In Montana, they've pretty much been flat, right around $800 an acre for cropland, and now pasture land down in that $500 range. But really atypical if you look at, especially going east and into the Midwest from here. The other part of this, you might want to look at the debt side. I've spent the last 6 months working on lending issues. The top line here, the green line, is how small businesses have done in terms of the flow of capital. And you notice starting in 2008, that number began to decline. In fact, it was down about 8.5% between then and 2010. But look at the bottom of this. Agriculture did fine. they at least were able to maintain their access to capital. We can even narrow this down to Montana. And boy, our Montana lenders have come through. As much as we complain about the banking sector here, they came through. Small businesses had money, at least access to capital in general, and agriculture did as well. And both of those numbers increased just a bit, which was pretty positive during some times that weren't really very good economic times here. So who are the winners and losers? Boy, our wheat producers are smiling out there these days. They have these prices that are just going ballistic. Not quite like they were a couple years ago, but still very good. And of course, yields are great. We just had some great growing seasons. Cow-calf producers are finally smiling for the first time in quite some time. And again, this is all pretty much price-driven. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We're a little bit concerned about why the cow-calf sector isn't expanding, but some other issues associated with that. If you're down the Yellowstone Valley, sugar beet people are really very happy. This is the best year they've had that many of these people can remember. We have sugar prices that are up almost 75% over a couple of years ago. And boy, they've had some decent production years down there as well. So those three groups of farmers and ranchers have done quite well. There's some people who haven't done so well. Barley producers and hay producers have both realized some declines in income. This is kind of what crop production looks like in the state, and when we begin to think about crop impacts, which we'll talk about at the end of this presentation, keep in mind that when we talk about grains, we're talking about the triangle north of Great Falls. And we're going to talk about some big numbers that are going to influence the Great Falls economy here, maybe more so than over here in the west, but it's going to reverberate across the entire state. Our biggest grain producing county is over at Choteau, so if you go to Fort Benton, that's kind of where it's all headquartered here. Grain prices have been up. At least two of those lines are up. You notice the red and the blue lines are up. Those are spring and winter wheat. That barley is down. And what happened to barley? Well, a couple things. One of them is that this ethanol scare. There was some time during the summer they thought that the ethanol production might actually decline. So corn prices moved down and also barley. Secondly, we had a lot of barley that didn't make it this year as malting barley. It ended up having been sold as just regular old feed barley. So a couple dynamics in that market. But barley prices have still not recovered and not overly optimistic about where barley is going. Grain production, as I mentioned at the outset, just a huge story in the state with this, especially with spring and winter wheat and barley, all of them being way up. And just, again, I can thank our experiment stations as well and mostly the weather for that. I don't have to do too much to forecast prices because we have people that play these games all the time. They're commodity traders, and that's great because I can depend on what they know. Look at these grain prices, $9 grain prices. I mean, keep in mind, a lot of Montana farmers know how to exist on $5 grain. So they know how to really get with it on $9 grain, and they look very good out into September of next year. The only problem is that you think, well, why don't they go ahead and hedge into those markets now so they can sell their grain at that price? Well, you can't just do that. There are not active God clauses in these contracts. So if you can't deliver the grain, you have some big financial problems on your hands. So we'll have to see how this all how it all works out between now and next fall. But right now, anticipating relatively high grain prices, corn prices way up. And again, these corn farmers can make money at $2.50 corn, and now they have corn that's over $6.50. The big story, and this is where we can all thank, at least Montana producers that grow wheat can thank Prime Minister Putin. Grain production in the former Soviet Union countries was off by over 25%. It was a huge drought that happened, and mainly in Russia and some degree in Kazakhstan. They decided they were going to embargo all the grain. They weren't going to allow anything to be shipped out kind of in midsummer. We saw prices move up from about $4.70, which we thought was going to be really a very poor year in Montana. They actually spiked over around $7, $8. They kind of settled back in the $6 range. Then we had this drought, this flooding that occurred in Australia. That has added to this. We now have prices that are in that $8.50 to $9 range. So things have really changed. But the big story this year was the former Soviet Union countries that had this substantial drought. Okay, just a little bit about livestock. Livestock is a little bit more spread out in Montana, not concentrated so much as our crop agriculture kind of is up in the triangle, but a couple counties are very important. Yellowstone County, still our biggest agricultural producer, primarily feeding a lot of cattle in Yellowstone. And then we go to the rest of the part of the state's primarily cow-calf producers, with Beaverhead over here in the west being the biggest, the most important of those. The cattle prices have moved up some. They're up about a little over 20%, and people are reasonably optimistic. I think that we're a little bit concerned that this sector hasn't gotten any bigger. We are actually looking at a cow herd in the United States right now that's smaller than it was in 1950. Things have really happened. A lot of things have happened in that market. Of course, cattle producers have become a lot more efficient. They're much better producers. We actually produce about twice as much beef per cow as we did back in those days. But it's been a very difficult market. If you look at the demand for beef, if you take a particular cut of beef at a particular price, those things have tailed off almost 50% over the last 3 decades. So our cow-calf people, of course, are concerned about that as we look down the pike. The market looks better, though. And why is it looking better? Well, both in the grain and the cattle side, exports are really looking very promising. And that's what's happened with the beef market, where looks like we're going to finally be over this time of the BSE scare that happened back in the early 2000s. It's kind of been mitigated almost totally. I think we'll be back just about to the same percentage of production that's being exported as we had back in the early 2000s. So that's very positive. These beef prices make these ranchers smile. When you're looking at $1.28, they'll actually get about $4 more than this for their calves, so they're thinking about $1.30, $1.32 this fall. And boy, they can live with those kind of calf prices. So what about this economy that's out here? The strength of this economy is really depending on what happens with the domestic and the foreign scene. The foreign agriculture, the international trade aspects of this are just absolutely critical right now. We're very excited about what we see in the foreign markets, and especially as we look toward Asia. That's the thing that's looming on the horizon and is a big concern to us is the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is being negotiated right at this point in time, and there are 3 major issues out there. Well, the first of those is the federal budget. And undoubtedly, there's going to be some reductions in federal budget, and I'll tell you, agriculture is at the top of the list, unfortunately. It looks to us as if the program that's likely to be cut are the direct payments programs. I'll have you do just a little bit of arithmetic here in just a minute. But direct payments are the largest single component of the agricultural programs, and I think it's likely to go away. Well, what's going to be the impact of that? Well, here's your arithmetic exercise. There's about 8 million or so acres of wheat and barley in Montana, and about $10 per acre is about what we're likely to lose in direct payments. So, $80 million or thereabout, is about where we're looking at this, the impact of this. So we have a substantial issue coming down the pike with the Farm Bill. Secondly, we have just lost a trade dispute with Brazil, with the World Trade Organization. It's now costing us $140 million to help settle that. But it's put everybody on notice that we can't continue on with farm programs as we have in the past because people are going to challenge us on those. So we're going to see some restructuring likely in the Farm Bill as well, so we have more programs that are a little bit more what we would call WTO compliant. And lastly, we're concerned about the baseline. Well, what's the baseline? How to do this? Well, in the last few years, we've had very good agricultural years in general, so our baseline has moved down, so we're not paying out very much in agricultural subsidies. So we're a little bit concerned that we could end up in a situation where we'll have the numbers are too low that we won't have enough money set aside if we end up with an agricultural sector that's in trouble. So we have all these issues that are floating around there with respect to the farm programs. Okay, I want to talk just about 3 emerging sectors here just for a moment because there are some other things apart from the kind of 85% of the Montana economy or agricultural economy that are also important. One of those is the organic sector. Now you can look at this. Organic groceries right now comprise about 3.7% or so of your grocery bill. And this has grown very substantially over the last few years. But look at that blue line that's in the forecasts for organic agriculture. While it's growing very rapidly, it's now projected to slow. These data were collected only in March of this year, and the 2010 data looks about like the 2009 data. So in as much as Montana we rank actually number 7 in the amount of acreage set aside for organic production. It's a relatively small part of what we do, but a continuing growth sector, even though the growth has slowed some. But I'm quite optimistic that we'll see some positive, continued positive growth in the organic foods market. The second one of these is biofuels, and biofuel market in Montana has seemed to not get very much traction. Ethanol market has never been a big thing here because we don't produce any corn in Montana. So we go east of here and south into the Midwest, a lot of ethanol production because there's a lot of corn production. We have some potential for biodiesel production here, but again, the traction, we just have not got a lot of traction with biodiesel. We hear a little bit about camelina, we hear a little bit about safflower, canola, all these things that can be used for production of biodiesel. We only have one commercial biodiesel producer right now. There's estimates on how much is coming out of that plant, maybe 100,000 gallons or so. A few people have small biodiesel plants on their own farms and ranches, again, really relatively minor. If we took all the oil seeds we produce, it would probably satisfy a little over 1% of our diesel needs in Montana. So it just doesn't seem to have gotten the traction that we hoped a couple of years ago. Of course, all these technologies look a lot better when you have $5 or $6 gasoline and diesel, but we're not at that point right now. Okay, the last one of these is wind, and wind's important to farm and ranch community because we have a lot of leasing that goes on with farmers in particular, with these wind towers going up. And there's a lot of variance in how much people get from these. And they can vary from, a friend of mine has a wind farm over in central Montana, or he has some land where there's some towers. He makes about $5,000 per tower or so a year. Some of those deals have been up in the $15,000 range or so. It constitutes about 4% of electrical power in the state of Montana right now. The federal tax credits on wind will expire in 2012, so everybody is very concerned about what's going to happen with continued ramping up of wind power in the state of Montana. It looks like those growth rates are likely to slow. I think in the near term, up to 2012, we're looking at maybe 4 or 5% growth. We're going to have a little bit different path here in Montana because we have this sunburst plant, or this sunburst facility that's coming online. Beyond 2012, it looks like the growth in that industry is likely to slow down in the, around 1 or 2%. At least that's what the projections are. So, some other sectors that are out there that are really important to our farm and ranch community because they do, provide us a supplementary sort of income. So, with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
George, over time, we've heard a lot about alternative crops, mint in the Flathead, legumes in the Flathead, oil seeds and canola and all these things. And of course, we're very proud in Missoula of our farmers market, the local producers who contribute to that. We've got our great community gardens. All of that taken together, is it ever going to be significant enough that it might be a part of a presentation like this, kind of under miscellaneous, that's going to be significant enough to be up there with wheat and barley and cattle?
Okay. Actually, last year when I was here, I promised you that I would know a lot more about small farm agriculture. By the time I came back this year, unfortunately, we don't know very much additional information about small farm agriculture, but I tell you, it's one of the USDA's foci is on that because it's so critical that we figure out what to do with these other landholders that are out there apart from our big operators. So I'm optimistic that over time there certainly is going to be a lot more effort put into some of that. The thing that drives agriculture, and I think that all of you understand this here, but we're driven by commodity programs. I always tell people that, hey, if you're farming and ranching in Montana and you don't understand the public policy behind agriculture, you're not going to make it. Keep in mind that the ranch that the farm that John Tester was on up in north of Great Falls in Big Sandy, there used to be an orchard. The family farm that my wife's family had down in the Yellowstone Valley used to grow plums. all kinds of other products that were around, but the farm programs are very, very instrumental and very important in what we decide to raise for crops in the state. So things are changing. I think that the USDA is very interested in having a lot more effort put into small farm agriculture and see if some of these niche markets can in fact mature.
Question?
The impact of CRP payments projected in the new farm bill,
Okay.
and also the impact of the ethanol production on beef prices.
Okay.
Let's make sure everybody knows what CRP is, too.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. The Conservation Reserve Program is CRP. What's the impact of CRP? Well, there's about 32 million acres in the United States put into CRP. About 10% of that was in Montana. And what happened in Montana was quite unique. We had some CRP rates, some federal bids that were a little bit high. We actually had a higher percentage of land in Montana that ended up in CRP than many other states did, especially along the High Line. And with a lot of those contracts are now terminating. In fact, over the next 3 years they will. We expect a lot of that land to come out of CRP, primarily because the federal government's not going to bid so much money for them, and so it's going to come into part of our production base here in the state. So has some important impacts. I mean, it certainly I'm anticipating it could ease some of the leasing rates. There's going to be more land available, so maybe some of these guys can lease that land for a little less money. It's likely to increase our production of both wheat and barley in the state of Montana as well. In terms of ethanol, ethanol is going through kind of an interesting change these days. It used to be that ethanol prices pretty much followed the price of gasoline. It's turned out that more recently ethanol prices are really tracking more with the prices of other commodity crops, primarily wheat and barley. The fact that you raise a really very important point, and whenever we have high corn prices, what does that do to calf prices here in Montana? Well, those guys that buy these calves from us here in Montana don't want to pay so much money for them because they got to put more feed in them. And so that's been the impact. It's been realized that right now what's kind of happened with these cow-calf people in the state, they're just delivering heavier calves to some of these feeding operations they would normally, because just with corn prices being that high, they don't want to put them on corn for as many days as they used to. So some important impacts there.
All right, well, thank you, George. Whether we're interested in folks from outside Missoula moving in, whether we're in the home building industry, housing and real estate affect us all in one way or another. And here to talk more about that is our housing and real estate expert, Scott Rickard from MSU Billings. Scott.
Thank you and good morning. And first I need to do this. All right, ready? Smile. My kids don't believe I do this.
Is that one of those economic snapshots we keep hearing about?
That's right. And if I captured a few people actually still up and getting to their seats, my kids will say, "Look at everyone fleeing." So anyhow, yeah, my name is Scott Rickard, and I am director of the Center for Applied Economic Research at MSU Billings. For the last several years, we have been, for a number of clients, tracking the real estate and the housing market and industry in Montana and to a less degree across the nation. And I just want to tell you what we've been seeing and what we've been looking at most recently. First, let's start with the national conditions. It's been quite a year, or quite a few years, and I don't think it's bad to consider that. We had a period between 2005 and 2007 where we were seeing the number of sales nationwide decline by about 3% a month to a trough. And for existing home sales, that decline was not as steep, and it also started later and ended later. But then we had government stimulus, an attempt to put a floor on that, at least maintain the demand for housing, and that was somewhat successful during the period that it was in force. But then the stimulus ended, and for about 5 months there, we were seeing the lowest number of sales since they started keeping track in 1963. Now, if you look at the top news stories, 2010, and how it pertains to the housing market. First, it would be that Treasury, $600 billion Treasury purchase, trying to keep interest rates low and trying to also bail out some of these financial institutions that were holding paper that they could not convert at that time. Also, we have to look at such things as interest rates. Interest rates were very low for the most part in 2010, but still we had a period in November, I believe it was, or we had within a month that the prevailing interest rate went from 4.17 to 4.87 just in the course of a single 30-day period. And that started to get people thinking, gee, maybe these costs are rising and these prices will be rising. Next is the robo-signing, or the fact that we had a lot of foreclosure notices across the nation that were being signed off on by people who had never seen the paperwork. And some courts took issue to that, and that is part of the reason why there was a 23-state moratorium in foreclosures by some mortgage holders or some entities that were holding these papers. Part of that was the judges were in effect saying, if you're coming to me to sue because you got a bad French fry, you have to bring me the whole potato and put it back together before I'll let you sue. And this was the equivalent, they were wanting to see all this additional paperwork for everyone who held any little piece of an individual mortgage. And last was a jingle mail, which is another euphemism for people that were strategically walking away from their mortgages. They were underwater. Remember, earlier in 2010, an estimate was that 22% of the households were underwater. They owed more on their mortgage than they could achieve or that they could get if they were to be forced to sell at the current market environment. Won't dwell on that. We remember that there's all sorts of issues involved there. There's this moral suasion. You should pay for your mortgage. I was at a meeting a couple of years ago where I watched the former Treasury secretaries stand up to a room full of economists and lecture on us on why people should pay their mortgages, which I thought was strange. Then you have the other extreme. You have Mortgage Bankers Association, for example, strategically defaulting on their headquarters when they went underwater. So. Anyhow, and one last thing I'll just toss out there is Federal Reserve economists controlled for different factors when they were looking at the number of foreclosures in an area, and actually found that after you controlled for differences in how people tended to feel about mortgages and feel about walking away from obligations, they found that in some areas they could only describe the fact that they saw a great deal of foreclosures as like a contagion or like a contagious disease. That when you got to a certain level, people's mindsets changed and they were more willing to declare and walk away or allow themselves to be foreclosed on, even if they could afford the property. Currently, national conditions may be a little different now. It's still looking at about 580,000 starts, housing starts for 2010, or most recent estimate, annualized estimate. That was 1.4 million a few years ago at the peak. Home sales, 4.9 million, may have moved a little bit, but not that much. That's down from almost 7 million at the peak. Median price of existing home, $173,000. That's to remind us that when we hear about all these mega millionaire, huge priced homes that aren't selling, median price nationwide is not that different than the median price in quite a few counties in Montana. So we have more in common than we would expect. And also 30-year fixed at 4.5. That's been conducive. There's conducive to activity nationwide. There are thoughts that if it rises up much above 5, you'll see a considerable part of the homeowners out there with mortgages no longer seeing it attractive to even refi, and also decreased demand for new mortgages. And to look at 2.9 million foreclosures in 2010, that was an increase of about 2%. Half of them just occurred in just a handful of states. Interesting thing for some of these states, California, Nevada, Arizona, actually the number declined compared to the previous year, whereas in other states we're seeing an increase. For example, Washington, Oregon, saw an increase 10-15% in 2010. Now, this is a graphic I stole from Pat Barkey when he decided he didn't have enough time for it. I think it's wonderful. County-level foreclosure rates, and this is a density function. Red means over 6 or more foreclosures per 1,000 units, all the way down to gray is fewer than 0.3% or per 1,000 units. So you just see the mass of red there. You can see the areas that are hit in terms of density. Most likely your neighbor is going to be foreclosed on or have a foreclosed property within your neighborhood. Now, looking at home sales for 2010 using National Association of Realtors data, we'll notice that, first of all, the North Dakota, South Dakota, those totals are down about a third compared to 2009. Looking at Montana and Wyoming, those numbers or estimates are down in the neighborhood of 20 to 25%. And for Idaho, the numbers have not declined as much, relatively speaking, in the neighborhood of 10% overall, but they saw a drop far before we did elsewhere. Looking at a 10-year period, which I don't think is bad, to just remind ourselves of the fact that housing is still a fairly good investment. A 78 for North Dakota, let's say a 78% increase over 10 years, that's still amortized out to 6% a year. Not a bad investment, especially when you consider the tax breaks. Now, looking at the urban areas, the metropolitan statistical areas for which we can find detailed data, two things really strike me when we generated this most recently. And it wasn't the fact that we had a 95% 10-year growth rate for Casper, or the fact that, Boise, 33% for that Boise-Napa area. That's because they went up and then they came down. It's the fact that for the urban areas in North Dakota, they saw a 10-year price increase that was less than the statewide average. I think what you're seeing there is the energy boom driving up rural housing prices significantly. And for it to drive overall to a 78%, that means those values, those prices must be seriously climbing to overcome the 3 metro areas for which we have estimates. So another way to look at 10 years, I took all of the price levels and made them 100%, and then you just look at that path. And just briefly, what we're seeing there, the thick line is Montana. And you see from our peak, we were down about 7% based upon this estimate, but we still are showing about a 75% increase over 10 years. Wyoming and Idaho, similarly, they peaked and then declined. South Dakota peaked and then has basically been steady. And North Dakota is the only, in our region, the only state that still is showing an increase in prices. Also, let's stretch the period of performance out 20 years. Remind ourselves something there compared to, in the past 20 years, basically still for Montana, we're looking at about a 200% increase in average housing prices overall. And also look at the period between 1991 and about 2001, those first 10 years. If you were to draw a trend line, that is a line that best fit that 10-year period and project it off into the future. What we're seeing is with this total decline that we're showing now, we're pretty close to what the 90s would have predicted us to be at this point. So maybe we are returning to more of the status quo, the long-term stable growth rate. Now, taking it down to the metro area, this year I do not have a complete data set of all the different MSAs and all the different cities in Montana, so I have to make do with information that's been provided to me by various MLSs or reading blogs and newspapers. One thing to say, they're actually talking to the local realtor association. Turns out that Missoula did not see an increase in median prices. Actually, based on their numbers, we have a decline. So this is interesting. That would give three of the metro areas for the state. We're seeing both a decline in median price, which always is a better way to track than average price, and in number of sales. Now, you would think that if it's a normal good, Econ 201, if the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. But remember how the housing market was for several years? Prices were going up and quantities sold were going up, both, because it was a seller's market. Now we're seeing more and more of the metro areas showing the opposite, a buyer's market, and with that, fewer transactions taking place. And since I couldn't find a state-level total database which is publicly available, I thought I'd pull out Zillow. Everyone's seen Zillow. I always use it to get mad as to how much more my neighbors' houses are worth than mine. So there they report listing prices, median listing prices, which of course isn't as accurate as sales price, because you don't know how many concessions take place between the median, between the listing and the actual closing. Now, looking at that, though, pretty consistently we see compared to the previous year, listing prices have been declining. Suggests that, now some of that could be we've got different homes that are being listed now, but I believe some of that is also that we're seeing people actually pricing the homes that they have on the market, being willing to drop those prices. And now just as the last thing to see, okay, does it make any more sense, at a state level if we compare listing prices to what it appears has been changing, or happening recently? No, it's not. It's not really a clear picture. We still have, still Silverbow and Yellowstone County with sales up, despite the fact that it's showing that the prices are down. However, the others would all be consistent: Missoula, Gallatin, Flathead, with that green arrow changing to the red. With a case of we've got conditions with more homes wanting more homes on the market than there are buyers. And taking the foreclosure issue down to the county level, basically foreclosures at the county level kind of track, they basically track population and the number of households in the different counties. The more populated counties saw a larger percentage of the state total of foreclosures. Some disparate impact: Flathead, far and above 22%. That's far and above what they would represent in terms of a part of the state total. And another is Ravalli County, which is far and above its representation. Still, overall, we, as a state level, we were fairly blessed with not being more heavily hit by it. Of course, in some parts of the state, like over here, you did see levels that were more consistent with what you're seeing in other states. And it, to this day, remains difficult to explain to people on the eastern side of the state what is going on in terms of foreclosures over here, where you're in the middle of it. The other graphic that I stole is a density function again. How many foreclosures per 1,000 households? And to me, it's less important looking at the red as it is the blue, which is the second highest tier. Between the red and the blue, we basically track out most of the so-called boot, showing the populated and the growth areas for the state in terms of the number of foreclosures and foreclosure density. These other pockets, I'm not really sure what's going on there, but we have to remember that there are relatively few households overall in some of these counties. Last, I have to admit to the danger of trying to be an optimistic economist. In the briefing book, I was stating that county business or building permits were up, and that was a reason to be optimistic. Actually, no, I read the sign wrong. They're down in 2010. A factor of 30%, 50%, and that doesn't bode well. Of course, building permits are in the urban areas are a necessary requirement for construction activity, and we did not see as much new home construction compared to the previous year, and it's doubtful that we will see much of a rebound in that in 2011 either. Not that I have hard data, but it just does not appear to be much driving that. So looking, since we can't go from the top down, let's look at the basic underlying factors that may be influencing the market for the next, for 2011. Well, with increases in the economy, we may see some increased interest amongst buyers to consider purchasing a home. Remember, we have such issues as, family formation. Got to have that in another bedroom so you can get away from the kids. You have people, as people age, they are more likely to own a home. And sellers obviously remain interested. They still want to sell the units. However, financing, I believe, in 2011, and from what anecdotally I'm hearing from title companies and others, will remain a major problem in 2011. Demand constraints. First, I think for the most part, the speculative market for purchasing homes is gone. You may have a few entrepreneurs that are still buying, trying to pick up properties to hold, but now they're more likely trying to pick them up to buy and to convert into a rental as opposed to buying them and flipping them. And also there are fewer households that are just saying, I'm just going to buy another couple homes, and that's going to be part of my retirement portfolio. We're seeing far less of that. And also, as I mentioned earlier, fewer buyers are qualifying. If you've looked at the standards and the requirements now to qualify for a mortgage, we're back to the 80s, if anything. You have to have a very good credit score. The credit scores are being looked at much more carefully. You need that down payment. And I believe there will be a significant number of people that will consider going into the market and looking for a home, and to turn around and find out we just can't qualify anymore. On supply side, yes, we have the foreclosures. It's not a huge issue, but even for areas around here, you have those additional units that are on the market competing with whoever else that's trying to turn their house. That is going to keep a brake and keep a brake on the pricing, on the prices for homes. I think, through this year. And mortgage loan availability, the opposite of it's so hard to find, relatively speaking, harder to find a loan, is there are fewer entities that are providing mortgage loans right now. And until we've straightened out and we see longer track record on how these foreclosures roll up and how the can these financial companies get out, take the property over, what are the costs of that? Until that is straightened out, I think we are not going to see much of an expansion in the availability of mortgages. And with that, I'd be happy to try and answer any questions.
That's how we're all going to feel after lunch, I'm sure. Questions on real estate, housing, the market here. I'll just ask a question statewide. It looks like from the latest, what we're hearing about the latest census, we're still going to remain under 1 million people as a state. Will it take a large influx of population? We need to have some net in-migration to get over that $1 million hump and move forward in population for housing and real estate to truly be stable and on a long-term upward track.
I don't think it's a necessary requirement, but I think it would definitely help. Yes, we do. We don't have a great population growth rate, and some of that is that's net inflow, right? Because that we have kids growing up, going to college, going to school, and then they leave. Relatively speaking, if we could either hold on to more of them or see additional people choose to move in, yes, that may help improve that imbalance that we have between supply and demand. See someone?
I think I see our county commissioner moving to the mic again.
Uh-oh.
Who has, some the property values have some impact on how she does her job. Jean?
So what's your prediction about what the U.S. Congress will do in regard to letting us deduct our mortgage interest?
Well, it is a pretty big hunk of money that basically the federal government allows us to keep. I always like that idea there. I think it would represent such a drastic change that I really can't imagine it changing abruptly. Now, if they want to start phasing it in, saying there's a maximum level at which you can still get that deduction, and then over time incrementally trying to move that, I think that's a possibility, and that would probably have less of an impact. But that's one of those sacred tenets, that mortgage deduction.
All right, thank you, Scott.
Thank you.